Hello and welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology, Human Nervous System Lesson 4. We're going to focus on the major parts and functions of the brain. We talked about the big three parts last time. We're going to break those areas down a little bit more today. We're going to focus on how to break those areas down between sensory, association, and motor areas. We're going to talk about the location, formation, and function of the cerebrospinal fluid, and we're going to list the main types of memories and be able to give examples of each. So, breaking the cerebrum down even further, you have your cerebral hemispheres. This is when you divide the brain into the right and left side. So, when you take it and you just kind of slice it in half, and you have your left and right side of the brain. Connecting the two hemispheres is an area called the corpus callosum, and it's just kind of this middle area here that connects both sides. Convolutions of the brain, these are just going to be those wrinkles that you can see in the brain, in the cerebrum. You can have deep grooves known as fissures, you can have shallow grooves known as sulcus, and then the bumps are known as gyrus. Each of them are named based on where they're found. So the superior frontal gyrus, superior top frontal towards the front, gyrus is just a bump. So you won't have to know these, but every part of the brain does have a name based on its location. The cerebrum is broken down into 4 lobes. You have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Then in between the two halves of the brain, you have what is known as a longitudinal fissure. They separate the right and the left half. So the longitudinal fissure would be right here. You also have an area known as the transverse fissure, which separates the occipital lobe, which is this back part of the brain, from the cerebellum, and then lateral fissures, which separate the temporal and parietal lobes. So here's a close-up of that lateral fissure. So what do those lobes of the brain do? They each kind of serve a different purpose. So the frontal lobe is going to be the decision-making lobe. It functions in planning, organizing, thinking, making decisions. It also does control your emotions and behavior as well as your personality. Next, you have the motor cortex, which is involved in movement, motor meaning to move. Then you have your sensory cortex, which is involved in sensations like feeling different things. So like feeling the weight of something when you lift it, or feeling pressure, or when you put your hands under water, feeling how the water makes your hands cold. The parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is involved in perception and making sense of the world, so this is also going to be more of your logical section with the math and spelling and putting things together. In the back is the occipital lobe, and it's specifically involved with vision. So it's taking the information from your eyes and interpreting it into what you see and what you actually notice versus everything that you take in. And then finally, the temporal lobe is involved in memory, understanding, and language. So if somebody is suffering from amnesia or has speech problems that are not like caused by a physical problem, it could be something in the temporal lobe. The ventricles of the brain are next. These are going to be kind of open cavities, and they're going to have the cerebrospinal fluid inside of them. The cerebrospinal fluid, it protects and supports the brain, so when it keeps it from moving around too much and helps kind of give it a buffer if the brain is moving around too much. Sometimes doctors will need to do procedures called spinal taps, which is where they take a needle and pull spinal fluid, the cerebral spinal fluid, from your spine so that way they can test it. It's a very good diagnostic tool for things such as meningitis or diseases like multiple sclerosis or cancers. There are other areas of the brain that are just known as association areas. So this is just used in interpreting and analyzing information. And so you can see the areas. Again, you have your frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital, and temporal lobe. So all of these have other functions in addition to what we had listed before. The brainstem is made up of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So what these parts do. The dicephalon is actually your hypothalamus and your thalamus together, and they work very closely with one another. The hypothalamus regulates your hormones, your heart rate, your blood pressure, your body temperature, hunger. It attaches to your pituitary gland, which is the red little blob in here. So this would be your hypothalamus and thalamus. The thalamus is just kind of the relay station for this information. You have your optic tract as well. Your optic tract is basically this optic nerve. They come back and they kind of cross over one another. You have a piece that crosses over and runs back, and then you have a piece that comes right down and goes back, so that way you're getting information from both eyes at the same time towards the back of the brain on each side. So when it uses the information that it's seeing to put together the picture of the world, it takes it and kind of combines all of it together back here. Your midbrain is responsible for your visual reflexes and eye movements. The pons is going to be sensory information, and then the medulla is your heart, respiration, and blood pressure, the things that you really don't control. Your pituitary gland, when we talk about the endocrine system, will be very important because it's kind of the master gland. It controls pretty much most of the hormones within your body. Next, you have the hippocampus. The hippocampus controls your memory. The name hippocampus comes from the meaning seahorse, so it's based kind of on the shape. Kind of see the same shape a little bit. After the hippocampus, you have the amygdala. The amygdala is storing the memory, so the hippocampus involves all of memory, and then the actual process of storing the memory kind of falls on the amygdala. And these are going to be memories more associated with emotional events. So when you were really happy or you were really scared. And so they're associated with fear responses and aggression, which is why if somebody suffers from PTSD, they may have an overactive amygdala, causing those fear responses or those aggressive responses to be even more than what they would be in a person who doesn't have PTSD. And focusing in on memory, there are several different terms that we use to classify memories, the two big ones being long-term and short-term. That's what we used to call it. There's actually new classification, and it's into 4 memory systems. So we're going to talk about basically how you store that information and then how you go back and get it after you've stored it. So we're going to talk a little bit about short-term versus long-term and the 4 main types of memory. So when you break down human memory, you have sensory, which is less than a second. So this is when you're looking around, you don't really remember every single thing that you see. So your brain picks out the most important things and has you focus on that. And so your sensory memory is everything coming in at once, and then your brain focuses on specific things. Next, you can put something into short-term memory. This is known as your working memory. These thoughts typically memory lasts around a minute or so. This is really good for remembering phone numbers or dates or times or things like that for just like a really brief period of time. And then finally, if you focus on something enough, you can put it into long-term memory, which lasts a lot longer, sometimes your entire life. There are two types of long-term memory. You have implicit and explicit. Implicit memory is going to be more unconscious, things you don't have to think about. So riding a bike, something along those lines, or how to sign your name. Explicit memory, on the other hand, are more things you have to think about. This would be declarative memory of facts and events, which can occur in two different ways as an episodic memory, so like a video playing kind of in your head. And then semantic memory, which is going to be facts or concepts, which are kind of what you're learning here. Like knowing the different types of memory would be part of your semantic memory. And then remembering watching this video would be more episodic memory. So episodic is involved in remembering personal experiences, such as a phone conversation you had yesterday or a movie that you watched. Semantic is going to be remembering specific little details, number of days in a year, color of the rainbow, things of that nature. So some examples of semantic memory would be, what would you call this image right here? What is this thing in the picture called? Where kangaroos live? Who is the vice president? All of those are just simple, straightforward facts, and that is stored in your semantic memory. Procedural memory is going to be activities or skills that you learn, so riding a bike, driving a car, they're things that you don't have to really think about doing. And then finally, working memory, it's the temporary storage. It doesn't last forever. So you would use something like this if you are memorizing things really quick before a test or in playing game memory. So when I post this PowerPoint, you will have a link to a game that you can try that focuses on your working memory. There is going to be an assignment posted on our website, so please make sure to complete that. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.